The signal came without warning, a faint pulse clawing its way through the static of deep space. It was brief, almost imperceptible, like a whisper on the edge of hearing. A red indicator blinked once on the far left console in the Black Star's communication bay. Ensign Darius Holt narrowed his eyes at the screen, unsure if he had even seen it. The relay often spat out false signals, ghost echoes from cosmic debris or long-dead satellites drifting aimlessly across forgotten sectors. Holt shifted in his seat, rubbing the fatigue from his face with the palm of his hand. Another glitch, he thought. Still, he leaned forward over the console to pull the last 30 seconds of data. Another pulse. Longer this time. 3 short bursts, then silence. Holt froze. A sealed frequency. Alien encryption. He hesitated. This wasn't protocol. The Black Star was a listening post, a lonely speck in the galactic backwater where nothing ever happened. Its crew monitored cargo lanes, pirate activity, and faint bursts from dying stars. Intercepting encrypted alien transmissions was not part of the daily routine. Holt exhaled slowly, then tapped the internal comm. "Captain Nolan, we have something." A pause. Then Nolan's voice came through, low and calm. "On my way." Holt glanced around the comm bay. No one else had noticed. They never did. Routine dulled the senses out here. The station had been in orbit around the barren edge of the Carvala expanse for nearly 3 years. This far out, there was only emptiness. No colonies, no fleets. Just the long hum of engines keeping Black Star locked in its quiet vigil. The door hissed open, and Captain Nolan stepped inside, his uniform jacket unfastened, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. Holt straightened instinctively. Nolan didn't acknowledge it. His focus was already locked on the blinking indicator. "What are we looking at?" Nolan asked, stepping closer. Holt gestured to the waveform now displayed on the main console. "Encrypted signal, sir. Alien origin. Frequency's tight, and the relays are struggling to hold it. But it's definitely there." Nolan leaned in, squinting at the cascading data. The transmission came in fragments, distorted by static and interference. Holt boosted the gain, but the audio that filtered through was broken and warped. "Run it through the decoders," Nolan ordered. The ensign nodded, initiating the process. The room filled with the sound of distant, distorted voices, scraps of alien words clinging to the edges of the transmission. It was slow work. The station's software wasn't optimized for this kind of decryption. Nolan folded his arms. "Where's it coming from?" "Rough estimate puts it near Sector 117, but there are no registered fleets there," Holt replied. "Closest system is Calros Minor, and that's 2 sectors out." "Deep space," Nolan murmured. "Could be a stray distress beacon." A burst of clearer audio cut through the static, sharp and urgent. Holt adjusted the filters. A voice emerged. The alien dialect was rough, but the station's translation software worked rapidly to adapt. "Ender attack. Civilians. Repeating. This is Commander Alrek of the Vornar fleet. To Admiral Jorak. We are under attack. Our fleet is evacuating. Immediate assistance required. Coordinates transmitting. Please, respond." Nolan's eyes narrowed. The voice was strained, layered with static and distant explosions. He glanced at Holt, who had stopped breathing. "Is that real?" Holt asked, barely above a whisper. Nolan didn't answer. He knew the sound of desperation when he heard it. "Trace those coordinates," he said, his voice suddenly sharper. "I want to know exactly how far out they are." Holt got to work, fingers flickering across the interface. Nolan straightened, turning toward the observation window at the far end of the room. Beyond it, the black canvas of space stretched endlessly, unbroken by the light of any nearby star. The Black Star drifted alone, a solitary outpost at the edge of humanity's reach. He had been stationed here long enough to know that out in the quiet, things could go unnoticed for years. Entire battles could play out in the distance, hidden by the vastness. Another pulse rippled through the console. "There it is again," Holt said, louder this time. "Same coordinates, It's repeating every 90 seconds. Silence filled the comm bay. Nolan didn't move. The screen flickered as the transmission looped again, waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. Sector 117 is empty, Holt said finally. I ran the scans twice. There's no fleet there, no response signal from Allied ships. If they're expecting reinforcements, they're not coming. Nolan exhaled through his nose. Run a full sweep of the area. Check for cloaked ships, derelicts, anything. Yes, sir. As Holt carried out the order, Nolan stared at the black expanse beyond the glass, listening as the alien voice echoed once more. The sweep returned nothing but cosmic drift and radiation spikes from distant stars. Nolan tapped the console impatiently as the data looped for the third time. It felt like searching for shadows in the dark. No sign of anything, Holt reported quietly, his gaze fixed on the cascading sensor data. Even residual radiation is minimal. If there was a fleet here, we'd see it. Nolan didn't respond immediately. The words of the transmission looped in his mind, the strained voice, the static-laden desperation. He shifted his focus to the audio waveform dancing on the secondary display. It didn't make sense. A signal this clear, broadcasted directly to this sector, where nothing but the black star drifted. No debris, no reinforcements, just silence. And yet, the message was still transmitting. Holt broke the quiet. Should I send another sweep, sir? Nolan shook his head. It won't show anything different. We're the only ones out here. He pushed off the railing and crossed the comm bay. His eyes never left the display. Send a report to Admiral Callahan. Flag it as priority 2. The Admiral would see it soon enough, but Nolan already knew he wouldn't wait for permission. Holt hesitated. Permission to speak freely, sir? Nolan gave him a sidelong glance. Go ahead. Holt shifted in his seat. It's just, if that was us out there, we wouldn't be waiting for authorization. We'd already be moving. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. You think I'm hesitating? I think, Holt said carefully, whoever Commander Ulrich is, he sounded like he didn't have a lot of time left. Nolan held his gaze for a long moment before turning back to the display. He knew Holt was right. The black star was far from Earth's core systems, and out here, decisions carried more weight. By the time Callahan read the message, there was a good chance that fleet, if it even still existed, would be reduced to scrap. Nolan's gaze lingered on the empty sector map, the pulse of the distress signal marking time like a slow heartbeat. He exhaled through his nose, already knowing the answer before the words left his mouth. Prepare the Artemis and the Solace, he ordered. I want 2 patrol ships running silent within the hour, full stealth protocols. Holt straightened. Yes, sir. The comm officer tapped quickly at the console, relaying orders down to the hangar bay. Within moments, the deck hummed with renewed activity. Nolan watched the flurry of personnel moving through the holofeeds as preparations began. The Black Star was not a warship. Its hangars carried only a handful of patrol-class vessels, lightly armed and designed more for reconnaissance than combat. But they were fast, maneuverable, and silent against the dark. As Holt coordinated deployment, Nolan opened a secure channel to Callahan's fleet, embedding the initial transmission along with the patrol orders. The Admiral would see it soon enough, but by then, Nolan intended to already have eyes on the sector. Another pulse echoed through the comms. Nolan glanced at the console, the same coordinates, same 90-second interval. The message repeated, but this time something was different. Static distorted the transmission, and Holt adjusted the filters as the audio struggled to break through. A voice emerged, fractured by interference. It was the same voice, but thinner now, fragile. This is Commander Ulrich. 2 civilian transports down, thousands lost. We cannot hold them back much longer. Admiral Jorak, anyone, please respond. We have millions of civilians aboard these vessels. We cannot protect them. Please, help us. Holt's knuckles whitened as the alien voice cracked through the static. For a long moment, no one moved. The weight of thousands of lives hung heavy in the stale air of the comm bay. Silence filled the comm bay, Nolan's jaw tightened. Holt turned in his chair, his expression grim. "Sir, they're dying out there." Nolan said nothing. The screen flickered as the transmission looped again, waiting for an answer that wasn't coming. "Sector scans are still negative," Holt added. "I ran them twice. If there was supposed to be a defense fleet, it never made it here." Nolan's eyes didn't leave the display. It wasn't just an unanswered distress call. It was an entire fleet left to fend for itself, abandoned in a sector where they thought safety waited. His fingers hovered over the comm control. "Send another message," he ordered. "Encrypted frequency, direct line." Holt nodded and patched through. Nolan leaned forward. His voice was steady, but low. "Commander Alrek, this is Captain Nolan of the Black Star. Your message was intercepted. Hold your position. The humans are coming." For a few seconds, no one moved. Holt's hand hovered over the console, as if expecting Nolan to rescind the order. Others across the bay exchanged uncertain glances, the meaning behind those 4 words sinking in like cold lead. It wasn't hesitation. It was the sheer enormity of what had just happened. "Did he say, 'We're going'?" one of the flight engineers whispered to a colleague. Nolan's eyes narrowed, catching the flicker of doubt from the corner of his vision. He stepped forward, letting the silence stretch just a second longer. "Yes," Nolan said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're going." The words struck like a hammer against the uncertainty in the room. Holt straightened in his chair, his focus snapping back to the console. "Begin pre-flight protocols for the Artemis and Solace," Nolan ordered. "I want full checks on all systems and loadouts prepped for engagement. 30 minutes. The order set the room into motion, but the undercurrent of unease persisted. Murmurs trailed behind the departing crew. "It's not our fight. They aren't human. They could already be dead by the time we get there." One voice finally rose louder. Lieutenant Reese, arms crossed at the back of the room, hadn't moved since the signal replayed. His voice carried the weight of frustration more than fear. "Sir, permission to speak freely." Nolan nodded without hesitation. "Speak your mind, Lieutenant." Reese took a step forward, glancing at the scattered personnel still lingering nearby. "This isn't protocol. We don't have orders from command. This isn't our fight." Nolan met his gaze without blinking. "It is now." Reese's jaw tightened. "Even if we go, we're not equipped for this. Sir, we're not a warship. We've got patrol-class vessels with recon specs. Those alien transports are under attack by something big enough to tear through civilian convoys. We'll be outgunned the second we arrive." Nolan took a measured breath and stepped toward Reese, keeping his voice level but firm. "I know what we have," Nolan said. "I know the limits of this station and every ship in our hangar. But there are civilians dying out there. Millions of them. And if we don't at least try, they won't stand a chance." He let the words hang there, letting them seep into the room. "If we're outgunned, we outthink them. If our weapons are light, we aim for precision. This crew was trained to survive out here at the edge of unknown space. We adapt. That's what we do." Reese stared for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "Aye, sir." Nolan turned back to the crew. "Get to work. You've got 28 minutes." The room emptied swiftly, leaving only Holt at the console. "You knew they'd push back," Holt remarked, not looking up from the screen as he cycled through diagnostics for the Artemis. "They wouldn't be worth commanding if they didn't," Nolan replied, stepping closer to observe the data feed. "It's our job to make the hard calls, Holt, even if they don't understand it yet." Holt's brow furrowed. "And Callahan?" Nolan's gaze drifted to the sector map, the pulse of the distress signal still marking its lonely position. "By the time Callahan gets this, we'll already be gone." The hangar was alive with movement, mechanics and engineers loading the Artemis and Solace with everything the Black Star had to spare. Munitions crates rattled against the deck, and the hiss of welding torches echoed as armor plating was reinforced over key sections of each vessel. These weren't warships, but they'd make do. Nolan walked the line between the two ships, nodding to crews as they secured modified railguns to the underside of the Artemis. The Solace had external missile racks hastily affixed to its flanks, still bearing the red markings of training ordnance now swapped for live payloads. Holt trailed beside him, datapad in hand. Engines are prepped, shields recalibrated for rapid discharge. Drones are equipped with sensor scramblers, but we're light on spare fuel cells. If this drags out, it won't, Nolan interrupted. His eyes fixed on the Artemis's cockpit, where a pilot ran last-minute checks. We're in and out. The last of the munitions were loaded, and the bay doors began to close. Nolan turned toward the observation deck overlooking the launch platform. Reese approached, helmet tucked under one arm. "All ships report ready. We're clear for launch," Reese said. Nolan stood quietly for a moment, watching as the last few crew members boarded. "Let's bring them home," he said finally, stepping toward the lift. The hangar lights dimmed, and the Artemis and Solace powered up, engines glowing faintly against the steel gray of the Black Star's bay walls. As Nolan entered the cockpit of the Artemis, he cast one final look toward the emptiness of Sector 117. "God help us," he murmured, the hum of the ship's reactors swallowing the words as they slipped into the void. The Artemis's engines hummed steadily as the Black Star receded into the backdrop of distant stars. The emptiness ahead stretched on, but the weight in Nolan's chest was heavier than the void outside. He tapped the comlink embedded in his console. "Holt, open a channel. Same frequency as the distress call." A flicker of hesitation crossed Holt's voice. "Yes, sir. Channel open." Nolan's voice cut through the hum of the cockpit. "Commander Alrek, this is Captain Nolan. We received your message. Hold your position. The humans are coming." Silence followed, broken only by the faint static crackling through the line. Holt shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking to Nolan for reassurance. No response. Nolan adjusted the comm again, leaning forward slightly. His tone softened, but the resolve in his voice remained unwavering. "You are not alone out here. We'll get to you. Just hold on." The static thinned, replaced by a faint click. Then a voice, fragile, distant, but unmistakably relieved. "Understood. Captain Nolan. We await your arrival." Holt's shoulders relaxed at the sound, but the tension in the cockpit remained. "The channel's still open," Holt noted, glancing at the fluctuating waveform. "They didn't disconnect." "They're holding on to hope," Nolan replied, settling back into his seat. "Keep it open." As the Artemis and Solace moved toward the jump point, Nolan's gaze lingered on the star map projected above the console. Sector 117 blinked faintly, still marked by the pulsing distress signal. Reese's voice filtered in from the second patrol ship. "We're in formation. Ready to jump on your mark, Captain." Nolan toggled the intercom. "Steady, Reese. Let's not make them wait." In the seconds before the jump, Nolan glanced at Holt. The ensign's usual smirk was gone, replaced by something far more solemn. "They're not sure we'll make it in time," Holt said quietly. Nolan's eyes met his. "Neither am I. But we're going anyway." The drive core surged, and the stars blurred into streaks as the Artemis and Solace slipped into the warp corridor. The journey through warp was short, but each second stretched unbearably. Nolan remained fixed on the status screens, watching tactical reports filter in from the alien fleet. Sparse messages relayed the scale of the destruction. 2 more civilian transports down, defense ships overwhelmed, fragments of alien vessels scattered across the battle space. Holt's console chirped. "Incoming transmission, same channel." Nolan nodded. "Patch it through." Commander Alrek's voice returned, clearer now. "Captain Nolan, we've lost 2 more ships. Civilians are crammed into the remaining vessels, but we cannot hold them off. The attackers, they seem intent on eliminating every last one of us." Nolan's jaw tightened. "How many ships are left?" 7, though 2 are barely holding together. "We've managed to form a defensive wedge around the larger transport, but..." Alrek hesitated. "We can't last another hour." Nolan straightened. "We'll be there in minutes." Transmit your coordinates and stay behind your strongest vessel. The moment we arrive, shift formation to draw fire away from the transports." "Understood. And Captain?" Nolan waited. "Thank you. I do not think anyone else would have answered." Nolan's eyes darkened. Anyone else wouldn't. The Artemis and Solace emerged from warp at the edge of a shattered battle space. Wreckage from fallen cruisers drifted lazily, torn hulls glinting under the faint light of a dying star. Nolan scanned the debris field, locking eyes on the hulking forms of enemy warships. Their railguns shimmered with residual heat. The Vornar fleet, battered and teetering, looked like prey waiting for the final blow. But they weren't alone. 4 massive enemy cruisers loomed just beyond the alien formation, weapons cycling up for another volley. Swarms of smaller fighters circled the transport ships like vultures, waiting to pick apart the remains. Nolan's hand tightened on the throttle. "There they are," Holt whispered, eyes wide. Nolan's voice was steady. "Let's end this quickly." The Artemis banked hard, breaking formation as the Solace veered right. Railguns powered up, missiles armed, and as the Black Star's patrol ships surged into the fray, Nolan knew one thing for certain: they wouldn't leave anyone behind. Holt's voice cracked through the comms. Multiple hostile signatures. 3 more enemy cruisers bearing down on the lead transport. Fighters are swarming their engines. Nolan's eyes narrowed as his gaze swept the battlefield. They're herding them, pushing them to collapse under their own weight. Reese's voice chimed in from the Solace. "Orders, Captain?" Nolan leaned forward, his jaw tightening as his eyes narrowed. The weight of the next move settled heavily in the space between heartbeats. Disrupt their formation, break the lead cruiser's flank, force them to scatter. The Artemis banked sharply, cutting through the wreckage as railguns spun to life beneath the hull, locking onto the closest squadron of enemy fighters weaving between the civilian ships. "Open fire!" Nolan commanded. The railguns roared, streams of tungsten rounds cutting through the black, clipping 2 enemy fighters in the opening volley. The remaining craft veered sharply, peeling away from the transports and looping back toward the Artemis. "Got their attention," Holt said, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. "They're coming around." "Let them." Nolan's gaze shifted to the Solace trailing just off their stern. "Reese, sweep the rear. Clear anything that tries to get behind us." "Aye, sir." As the Solace veered away, the Artemis surged forward, weaving through the drifting carcasses of shattered Vornar vessels. Each movement was deliberate, each burst of fire designed not to overwhelm, but to dismantle. The human patrol ships danced through the battlefield with precision, slipping between bursts of plasma fire and carving paths through enemy formations. "Direct hit on the lead cruiser," Holt reported, his eyes fixed on the display. "Minimal damage, but they're pulling back." Nolan watched as the cruiser's engines flared, its nose shifting away from the main formation. The enemy ships adjusted hastily, their cohesion unraveling as the Artemis continued its assault. "Reese, tighten up on their left flank," Nolan ordered. "Pin them down, keep them from regrouping." The Solace's missiles streaked across the void, hammering the second cruiser's exposed side. Its shields rippled, then buckled under the impact, flames venting from its lower decks. Holt's voice dropped slightly, the tension audible. "Captain, the transports are exposed. Those fighters are doubling back." Nolan's eyes flicked to the tactical display. 3 squadrons of enemy fighters arced toward the cluster of civilian ships, accelerating to intercept. "Reese, intercept those fighters. We'll cover the cruisers." "On it." The Artemis banked hard, thrusters firing at full burn to match the cruiser's retreat. Nolan's eyes never left the display, calculating every angle, anticipating the next move. The enemy fleet was rattled, but far from broken. A sudden flash of static erupted across the comms. The voice was faint, but it carried the unmistakable edge of relief. "This is Commander Ulrich. Your intervention, it's working. They're pulling away." Nolan didn't respond immediately. His focus was locked on the largest cruiser as it shifted course, angling toward the Artemis with renewed intent. "Not for long," Nolan murmured. His fingers hovered over the fire controls. "Let's finish this quickly." The Artemis surged forward, and the railgun spun to life once more, slicing through the dark with surgical precision. The enemy cruisers pivoted sharply, engines burning hot as they surged back into formation. Like predators scenting weakness, their cannons ignited, unleashing torrents of plasma fire across the void. The Artemis lurched hard to starboard, metal groaning beneath the strain as plasma fire scorched across her hull. Warning lights bathed the cockpit in a harsh red glow, and faint tremors rippled through the deck plating. Holt's voice sliced through the comms, strained and sharp. "Direct hit to the port side, shields holding, but they won't take another like that." "Keep moving," Nolan ordered, eyes fixed on the tactical display. "We can't let them box us in." The Solace darted across the enemy's flank, missiles streaking toward the closest cruiser. 2 detonations rippled against its shields, forcing it to divert power from its forward cannons. "They're regrouping," Reese's voice filtered in through comms. "Looks like they're bringing everything to bear on us." "That's exactly what we want," Nolan replied, tilting the Artemis hard to port. "Pull them in." The enemy's smaller fighters swarmed in response, peppering the Artemis's aft with railfire as they pursued. Holt gritted his teeth, hands flying over the controls. "They're like gnats," he growled. "I can't shake them." "Don't," Nolan said coldly. "Lead them." The Artemis twisted abruptly, tearing through the space between the shattered remains of Vornar ships. Glowing fragments drifted like asteroids, and the distant silhouettes of damaged transports flickered, their twin structures trembling under constant barrage. The enemy fighters followed relentlessly, their dark forms flashing beneath the distant bursts of explosions. Behind them, the faint shadow of the Solace slid silently into position. "Reese, now!" Nolan barked. A burst of missile fire from the Solace shredded through the cluster of pursuing fighters, tearing them apart in an instant. The remaining enemy vessels scattered, but not before another cruiser loomed into view, its cannons already locking onto the civilian transports. Nolan's pulse quickened. "Intercept that fire! Holt, push the engines!" The Artemis lurched forward, crossing directly between the enemy cruiser and the largest Vornar transport. Plasma fire raked across their shields, shaking the ship to its core. "Shields at 20%, Holt shouted. "I can't hold it much longer." "Hold the line," Nolan commanded, his voice steady. "Buy them time." Static crackled across the comms, and then Admiral Callahan's voice cut through, calm but firm. "Nolan, you have full authorization to engage. We can't sit back and watch this happen. Help is on the way." Nolan's grip tightened on the controls, his eyes narrowing as the targeting systems flickered to life. "I figured you'd say that, Admiral," he replied, already locking onto the next target. Suddenly, the comms flared to life with a voice Nolan hadn't heard in months. "This is Captain Varga of the UNS Bastion. Reinforcements inbound. Try not to get shot before we arrive." Holt's head snapped toward Nolan, disbelief flickering in his eyes. Nolan's expression stayed unreadable, but the faintest smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're not the only ones in this sector, Captain." Varga's voice carried a familiar sharpness, laced with warmth. "We might be far, but we're still your closest neighbors, and neighbors don't leave each other hanging." Nolan exhaled slowly. "Took your time, Varga." "I like to make an entrance," Varga replied, the grin audible in his voice. "Can't have you thinking you're the only hero out here." As Varga's transmission faded, the battlefield painted a grim picture. The largest civilian transport groaned beneath another barrage, flames trailing from its rear engines. "Captain, the main transport's coming apart," Holt snapped, urgency sharp in his tone. "She won't hold much longer." Nolan's gaze darkened. "Then we make sure she does." He flicked the comms. "Reese, form up. We're stepping in." "Aye, sir," Reese answered without hesitation. The Artemis and Solace slid into formation, advancing like an iron shield between the cruiser and the wounded transport. Plasma fire tore into their hulls, cracked plating flaring with sparks as each impact pushed their systems closer to the brink. Heat rippled across the bridge windows, distorting the black void beyond. Holt's eyes stayed glued to the shield monitor as the readings plummeted like a ticking countdown. Nolan's grip tightened on the armrest as the ship groaned beneath him. Brace for impact. Holt cast him a sideways glance. This is going to hurt. It's supposed to, Nolan replied, steady as the storm. The enemy cruiser's cannons ignited, and the void erupted in fire. The Artemis held firm, shielding the transport with every ounce of strength it had left. Then, through the flames and debris, the black horizon flared to life. Points of light multiplied, growing brighter until the silhouette of the UNS Bastion emerged like a shadow from the dark. Frigates and cruisers followed in formation, their weapons already hot, carving through the void like blades unsheathed. The fleet had arrived, and it wasn't small. The Bastion's cannons roared to life, unleashing a hail of fire that cleaved through the enemy ranks with merciless precision. The cruisers that had moments ago seemed poised to crush the remaining Vornar transports twisted awkwardly, breaking formation in a desperate attempt to evade the barrage. Nolan seized the opportunity without hesitation. "Push forward," he commanded. "We're not letting them regroup." The Artemis surged ahead, flanking the Bastion as their railguns pummeled the side of an enemy frigate, splitting it in two. Explosions cascaded through the cruiser's hull, its engines flickering and sputtering out as it drifted dead in the void. "Reese, keep the pressure on their rear guard," Nolan ordered over the comms. "Drive them toward us." "Aye, sir," Reese's voice replied, steady and sharp. The Solace peeled away, releasing another volley of missiles that streaked across the battlefield and found their mark on the smaller fighters, attempting to regroup behind the remaining cruisers. One by one, enemy signatures faded from the display as explosions illuminated the wreckage-strewn void. Holt's eyes flicked to the tactical readout. "Captain, their formation's collapsing. The lead cruiser's pulling away from the fight." Nolan leaned closer to the console, watching as the remaining enemy ships began to turn. Some peeled away in tight formation, others drifted erratically, engines flaring in disarray. "They're faltering," Nolan said quietly. Then louder, "Varga, tighten the noose. Don't let them hold formation." "Already moving," Varga replied. The Bastion's thrusters flared as she pivoted, driving the lead cruiser directly into the Artemis's line of fire. The combined barrage left the enemy vessel staggering, its cannons sputtering uselessly as its shields collapsed. On the far end of the battlefield, the last remaining cruiser hesitated, its engines glowing hot as it lingered near the Vornar transports. "They're stalling," Holt said, narrowing his eyes, trying to cover the retreat. "Not for long." Nolan's gaze locked onto the cruiser. Plasma fire still poured from its cannons, raking across the surface of the damaged civilian vessels. "Focus fire on that cruiser," Nolan ordered, his voice tightening. "We're ending this now." The Artemis and Bastion locked onto the target simultaneously, their combined firepower ripping into the cruiser's shields. Flashes of blue and white erupted along its hull as the barriers failed, and the blasts began to tear through its plating. The enemy vessel buckled under the assault, explosions rippling across its spine until, finally, its core detonated in a blinding burst. For the first time since the engagement began, the comms were silent. Holt exhaled heavily, slumping slightly in his chair. That's the last of them. The battlefield lay in eerie stillness. Wreckage drifted across the sector, glowing embers of fallen ships marking the remnants of what had been an overwhelming assault. Nolan's grip on the armrest loosened, but his gaze remained fixed on the tactical display. "Check the Vornar ships. Get me status reports. I don't want to lose anyone this close to the finish line." Holt's fingers danced across the console. A few moments passed before his expression darkened. "Sir, one of the transports is signaling distress. Structural integrity is compromised. They're reporting core instability." Nolan's jaw tightened. "Patch them through." Static crackled briefly before the weary voice of a Vornar captain filled the channel. "This is Transport 6. Our reactors are failing. We can't hold them any longer." Nolan straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing as he watched the transport on the screen. Its engines sputtered, and pieces of its outer hull peeled away, exposing sections of its reactor core to open space. "We'll get you out of this," Nolan replied firmly. "Varga, send engineers to stabilize their core. We'll hold position until they're secured." "Copy that," Varga replied without hesitation. "My crew's already moving." The Artemis drifted closer to the failing transport, shields expanding to cover its hull. Through the observation windows, Nolan could see the faint silhouettes of the Vornar crew working tirelessly to contain the damage, their faces drawn but resolute. "They fought until there was nothing left to give," Nolan murmured. "Now we hold the line for them." Smoke hung low over the Artemis's bridge, thin tendrils curling from scorched consoles as the last of the alarms finally silenced. Holt's hands hovered over the dimmed controls, his knuckles white as if letting go might unravel the fragile calm that had settled. Nolan's eyes traced the viewport, following the wreckage drifting silently in the aftermath. The battlefield had grown still, save for the faint glimmer of welding torches flickering in the distance as crews worked tirelessly to stabilize the damaged Vornar transports. Reese's voice filtered through the comms, quieter now. "Captain, the Bastion's teams are reporting core stabilization on Transport 6. She's holding together, but barely. They'll need dry dock repairs." Nolan nodded to himself, though the weight in his chest refused to lift. "Understood. Have Varga's team focus on reinforcing structural integrity. No one leaves until those ships are secure." Holt leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "We cut it close, sir. Another minute and that transport would have been scrap." Nolan's gaze remained on the Vornar vessels, their battered hulls reflecting faint starlight. "Close doesn't matter. We held." His voice carried the weight of the last few hours. Across the bridge, medics escorted 2 wounded crew members to the lift, their uniforms stained with smoke and blood. Nolan's eyes tracked them briefly before returning to the tactical display. "Status of the fleet? Solace has aft shielding down to 30% and heavy railgun damage. Artemis is running at 40% reactor output. Bastion's shields are holding, but her secondary cannons are offline. We're stable for now, but another engagement like that." Holt let the words hang. Nolan's expression didn't shift, but Holt had seen it enough times to understand. The captain was already calculating their next move. "Have the repair crews focus on the Vornar transports. We'll handle our own later. Tell Varga to keep his teams on standby. We're not leaving until those transports are stable." "Aye, sir." For a long moment, the bridge remained quiet, save for the distant hum of power cycling through damaged conduits. The faint glow of welding torches flickered along the hulls of the Vornar ships through the viewport, patches of light against the wreckage-strewn void. Holt folded his arms, eyes fixed on the tactical display. "They're keeping their distance," he noted quietly. "Haven't sent so much as a word our way." "They're watching," Nolan replied. His gaze swept over the drifting remains of enemy ships, now reduced to smoldering debris. "Trying to figure out why we stayed. They'll figure it out." Holt shifted his stance, but stayed silent. As damage reports continued to filter in, Nolan stepped forward, resting his hands lightly on the console as he stared out at Sector 117. The stars, no longer obscured by the haze of battle, gleamed brighter than before. "Hold position," Nolan said quietly. The docking clamps hissed as the Artemis aligned with the Vornar flagship's port side. Through the narrow viewport, Nolan watched as the docking bridge extended slowly, connecting both vessels with a metallic thud that echoed faintly through the hull. Holt stood at his side, arms crossed. "They're rolling out the red carpet." Nolan gave a slight nod but said nothing. He straightened his jacket as the airlock signaled pressurization. A soft chime followed. Time to board. The air inside the Vornar ship was heavier, the atmosphere thicker than what humans considered standard. It clung faintly to his skin, carrying the metallic tang of recycled air. 2 Vornar guards awaited him, their posture rigid, though not hostile. Without a word, they turned and led Nolan down a narrow corridor bathed in blue light. The hum of the ship's systems pulsed faintly beneath his feet. At the far end of the corridor, a door parted to reveal a wide chamber. Commander Alrek stood at its center, gazing out of a panoramic viewport that stretched across the room. Beyond the glass, fragments of ruined ships drifted slowly through the void, silent testaments to the battle that had just ended. Alrek's gaze shifted as Nolan approached. He offered no formal greeting, just a subtle nod of acknowledgement. "Captain Nolan," Alrek said at last, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. "Welcome aboard." Nolan stepped forward, stopping a few feet away. "Commander." For a long moment, neither spoke. The tension that hung between them was palpable, a shared understanding of what had transpired, and what hadn't. "It should not have come to this," Alrek finally said, his tone edged with frustration. His eyes flickered back to the drifting wreckage. There was supposed to be a defensive fleet stationed here. They were meant to intercept any threat long before it reached our civilians. Nolan followed his gaze but said nothing. "We sent the signal," Alrek continued, the lines around his eyes tightening. "Repeated it across secure channels. And yet, no answer came. Only silence." Nolan shifted slightly. "You assumed they would come." Alrek's jaw tensed. "They should have." A silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engines, the faint glimmer of distant stars reflected in the glass, indifferent to the weight of the conversation. After a moment, Alrek turned fully to face Nolan. "I must ask, why did you come? The signal wasn't meant for you. Humans had no obligation to intervene." Nolan met his gaze evenly. There was no hesitation in his reply. "We came because it was the right thing to do." Alrek studied him, searching for something beneath the simplicity of the words. Whatever he sought, Nolan doubted he would find it. Finally, Alrek's posture eased, if only slightly. He exhaled, the weight on his shoulders settling but not lifting. "Your arrival saved thousands of lives today, Captain. That is not something I will forget." Nolan inclined his head. "Neither will we." Alrek stepped closer to the viewport, his eyes distant once more. "I cannot say what became of our missing fleet. Perhaps they were delayed, or perhaps something worse befell them. But this sector will not forget humanity's actions today." Nolan watched him for a beat, then turned toward the exit. As he approached the doorway, Alrek's voice stopped him. "There are questions left unanswered, Captain." Nolan glanced back over his shoulder. "There always are." The door slid shut behind him as he stepped back into the corridor, the weight of unspoken questions lingering in the air. Nolan stepped back onto the bridge of the Artemis, the faint hum of the ship's systems grounding him as the doors sealed shut behind him. The quiet felt different now, less like the lingering tension of battle and more like the calm after a storm. Holt sat at the navigation console, casting a glance over his shoulder. "Vornar transports are aligning for departure. Looks like they've got enough power to make the jump." Nolan approached the central viewport, watching as the battered alien ships repositioned themselves. Their hulls bore deep scars, some sections dark and broken, but the engines flared steady. They would survive. The remaining Vornar crew aboard the Artemis had already begun returning to their ships, silent and efficient as they passed through the airlocks. None had spoken much, but their nods of acknowledgement carried weight Nolan wasn't sure words could match. "They're forming up," Holt added quietly, "preparing to jump." A flicker of movement caught Nolan's eye. The lead Vornar transport drifted slightly closer, its forward comm array lighting up. A moment later, the bridge speakers crackled to life with a single transmission. "This is Commander Alrek of the Vornar fleet," the voice came steady and clear. "Captain Nolan, to you and your crew, If the day comes when humanity calls, we will answer. You have our gratitude. We will not forget. The lead transport shimmered, its engines pulsing brighter as the warp sequence intensified. One by one, they vanished into the void, leaving behind only drifting embers of battle. Holt leaned back in his chair, arms folded, staring out at the empty space where the Vornar fleet had been moments before. "Think they'll really come if we call?" he asked. For a moment, Nolan let the silence settle, the weight of unspoken promises lingering in the space between stars. "They'll come," Nolan said quietly. "But that's not why we did it." Holt nodded, but said nothing more. Some things didn't need elaboration. Nolan turned away from the viewport, eyes sweeping the bridge. The crew had already begun returning to their routines, running diagnostics, patching hull fractures, and recalibrating weapon systems. The Artemis was bruised, but alive, and so was everyone aboard her. He stepped toward his chair, resting one hand on the console as the stars outside seemed to stretch on endlessly. "Take us home," Nolan ordered, his voice steady. "Aye, Captain." Holt's fingers danced over the controls, and the Artemis pivoted gracefully, its engines humming to life. As the stars drifted by, the empty void felt a little less vast. Hey there again. I'm glad you've come so far. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button. This is really important to the channel. Really important. And I have one more thing for you. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.